So good afternoon. We will start with, I want to encourage good habits. So that's why I want to start right away at 3:30. Today we will deal with another subject of maybe a little bit closer to us in time than last lecture. As you remember, what I did last time, it was to analyze few pictures by Plamondon representing nuns. I thought it was interesting in order to enter also in a kind of what I would say Quebec ethos of the time. See the way how religion was so important and how it could be reflected in the portrait. Today we do something similar to that, but we will deal with the relationship not of the subject with the divinity or with the sacred, if you want, but the relationship between man and the land and the territory, if you want. And the idea came to me last year, I imagine, when we had at the Museum of Quebec and also at the National Gallery a remarkable exhibition of Suzor-Coté. Maybe some of you have seen it, in which there was some pastel representing Habitant, this kind of farmer, old-timer, also old pioneer of the region where he came from Arthabasca. And my problem is how to explain the popularity of that theme, well, first in the work of Suzor-Coté, but also among his clients. So I will make maybe a lengthy introduction to explain that, to give you the context, I think, is behind the success of these portraits d'habitants. And then I will give you a few examples, and we will go on. I think the first explanation that comes to my mind, when these pastels were done during the 1910s and 1920s, you had a current of thought in Quebec who was very important, let's say, or very predominant, and that the historian Michel Brunet have called le courant agriculturiste. Well, you could say the ruralist current of thought. It was a time when the balance of the population was shifting from, let's say, the countryside to the cities. And many of these thinkers who were clerics, who were bourgeois intellectual or all that, got worried about this movement of population toward the cities. They were worried because they thought that maybe we will lose with this, the traditions, we will lose the old values, let's say, in terms of religion and morality especially. And so they they wanted to resist to this movement, of course, without too much success, but there was definitively a trend of that kind. Brunet, who wrote about it, was not very enthusiastic of it. He says the real bourgeoisie didn't give a damn of that. They were building the cities and they were building industrial strength and all that. They didn't want this kind of nostalgia of the past, and they brush it off. But and he described it also as a kind of people who are attached to the past, who are unsure of the present, and certainly doesn't want to look at the future. So like a kind of pacifist type of ideology, this current of agriculturism. But okay, this is you could say it's a kind of ideological backdrop to these type of portrait that I will speak later. But there is one more aspect to it that it's important to understand, and to my mind, make it really then correspond to a much more stronger current. And the idea is the following: it is suddenly you will have a connection between this agriculturist or ruralist trend and the nationalism in French Canada. The moment these two dangerous elements, let's say, will get together, then you had a current in which I think that this is my hypothesis that this type of portrait become very popular because people see in them a kind of illustration, or if you want, a symbolization of this double current, let's see, of of ruralism and nationalism. And the, let's say, the man who have done this connection the most strong fashion is the chanoine Gros, for sure. Many younger people don't know who is the chanoine Gros. We have even a metro station named after him. I will give you a little bit an idea of his ideas now, and maybe then it will evoke something. Chanoine Gros was not very enthusiastic of the cities to start with. If you read his text, you will find very often kind of denunciation of the city as a lieu de perdition. It's the place where you go and you lose your soul. He repeat more or less the things that you compare the countryside and the cities, and people will have this kind of characterization in which the cities is the place where family breaks, where you are exposed to indecent spectacle and everything, and bad books and everything. It's much better to live in the country where nothing of that happened, and where you can stay strong and close to your values, if you want. So first thing, it was the city is always contrasted, let's say, with the countryside as almost good and bad. I'd say a kind of Manichaean opposition between both. The worst thing that Gros reproaches to the city, it was to be the pole of attraction to the peasantry. For him, this was the catastrophe, that the people who were more or less autarcic, meaning that they had the control of their life in the country, were losing it when they came in the city, become workers, what he calls an inferior class, in brackets, and also lose all their economic autarcy and become very dependent of the factory life and everything. For him, this was the worst aspect of the city, to attract the peasant toward us. He was convinced, I would say, of the essential, or I would say the basic superiority of the life in the country instead of the city. It's not just that it's two different things. There was for him a much more amount of value, let's say, in the city, in the country than in the city. He used to quote Monseigneur Paquette, who is not a great luminary, but Paquette used to say, we should be known not as a commercial or an industrial nation, speaking, of course, of the French-Canadian, but as a nation immensely French and Catholic. You see. So with that, of course, you could revolutionize the whole world. So Gros defended this idea, and also, I think one of the period in which he thought that was the big turning point, let's say, and it was the time of the Great Depression in the 30s. He says then the mistake we did, it was to leave the country at that period. We should have stayed in the country, or even find new ground to settle elsewhere, in Abitibi, in the north, and anything. He says in that way we would have avoided the consequence of the crash, let's say, of the 1929 crash, which is not sure, but anyway, that's the way he saw it. You see, he says the big mistake we did then, it was not to encourage le retour à la terre, the coming back to the land, where he says we will have triumph, we will have our own values being more assessed, and that would have been our salvation. Okay. All these ideas that I just quote in a way are, let's say, a little bit ideas that you could expect from somebody who is on the right. They are not very original. You could find parallel to that in France, also in everywhere. But then he gave a special twist to it, and you will see that it will bring us to our painting. Gros was interested by one other problem. It was, how do we create a new race of people? He had this kind of racialist, I would say, twist to the reasoning by asking this question, how a new race of people can be created? And he followed on that kind of secondary philosopher, let's say French philosopher, was called Hippolyte Taine, T-A-I-N-E, Hippolyte Taine. And Taine was of the theory that you could explain a lot of things, let's say, through the climate, to the influence of the climate. And his hypothesis about the birth of new races, let's say, was, he says, it's very simple, it's like the animals. If you travel from one country to the other, or if you are exposed to a kind of new climatic regime and you are in a new region, then people will get modified, they will have to adapt to this new situation, and you will have your new race. And for Groulx, this was interesting because he thought, okay, this is more or less what is happening to the French Canadian. They come from France and they end up here in this country of bears and forests and cold climate. And so they have to adapt to this new area. And from this adaptation, we are creating a new race of French Canadian. When you give, of course, this not racist, but let's say when you begin to define also your nationalism in terms of race, you are on a dangerous ground. Because right away, okay, Taine is an older philosopher of 19th century, but right away we think of people closer to us, like Drummond, for instance, in France, who was opposing the people of the forest and the people of the desert. The people of the forest were the Aryans, and the people of the desert were the Jews or any other nomadic tribe, like he says. And for him, the forest was a more complicated type of surrounding in which higher race could be created and the lower race were coming from the desert. You see, when you begin to play with this type of concept, of course, you are not far from racism. And of course, Groulx have been accused of that. Some of the intellectual who loves him says, no, we have to be careful, and others who don't like him, like me, says he's a racist. And so you have discussion around this, but in fact, I think through the question, how do we make how a new race get born, he gave this, I think, this kind of more racialist, let's say, twist to the argument. And it is so this type of connection then that brings the idea of making portrait of Habitant as representing a new race of people. You understand how this comes suddenly to be translated in image. All this idea could be discussed intellectually, but then suddenly there was a possibility to translate them in an image if you find a subject, let's say, that will symbolize this conjunction: ruralism, nationalism, and racism. If you can put all this together in one type of people, you have suddenly a portrait who could be read by many people, who could be popular, if you want, in that sense, and could interest some artists. So I will show you a few examples of how it was translated, let's say, by Marc-Aurèle de Foix Suzor-Coté. What a name. It's a name that he created himself. Of course, he was not born like this. It was Monsieur Coté like everybody else. But his mother was Suzor, and so he created Suzor-Coté, and then he added the Foix. All this he did in France, let's say, to impress the French people, especially when you have a de. De is what we call in France la particule. This is only the noble people have this. De, there's no de Gagnon, for instance. This is impossible. It doesn't exist. Mais deux fois Suzor-Coté, it makes sense. Anyway, he created this thing. And then he painted, or draw, if you want, a series of these old-timer, let's say, old pioneer. He called them, like this one, le père Esdras Cyr. I remember in my childhood, we designate some habitants like this, like les pères. It have nothing to do with religion. It's just old guys of the village were called le père Esdras Cyr, like here. See? And you could call aussi la mère, for the same reason. Nothing to do with religion, just the old people of the village. So this one was called Esdras Cyr. And the pastel that you see, it's of 1911. It belongs to a private collection, but Suzor-Coté made probably close to 30 a portrait of this guy. He used to say that he made a lot of money with him. And he was clever, this old man, and he heard that Suzor-Coté was making money by selling his portrait, and he told him, Monsieur Coté, it's not just. You give me 30 cents or 30 sous, like he says, it's probably 25 cents, like we used to say at the time, for a séance, for a pose, and a pouch of tobacco, and I heard that you sell my portrait. He says $200 and $300. He says, c'est pas juste. It's not, you have to pay me more. And so Suzor complained about that the peasant are expensive model, you know, we have to entertain them and all that. They don't like to do it and everything. He was certainly a typical pioneer of the region where Suzor-Coté himself come from Arthabasca, from near Victoriaville, if you want, today, which happened to be also the birthplace of Sir Wilfrid Laurier. It's exactly of the same region. And these people were living in a place what's called les Bois Francs. Bois means wood, of course, and les Bois Francs because it was all forested before, and they were the one who made the forest go away to replace it by fields, and so they were really the creator, let's say, of the country. The Suzor will be interested, as you will see, to very old people all the time. And indeed, there's two things there. There's a kind of reflection on old age, and also a kind of reaction against it, I would say. Old age, of course, is a time when we are told that we become closer and closer to be a thing. If you want a sophisticated word to describe this process, you could speak of that we are reifié. In English, I think we could say reification, you know, that re in the term of res in Latin means a show, a thing, and so we're coming more and more like thing. And we end up as a thing, I guess, when we are really dead. Bon. So there is this, and indeed, this portrait could be described like this also, as if the personage has no more this mobility and this kind of potentiality that he will have if he was a portrait of a young man. He has very determined traits, and he seems like fixed a little bit. But on the other hand, the resistance to that, and I think this is what the Coté want to tell us, it is, okay, maybe the body is being reified like this more and more, like a turn, but the soul can be transcendent, could transcend this kind of process. And the soul is like, in a way, that you believe in it or not, it's not very important in a way, because you could say the soul is this kind of surplus that we always believe that we will be able to do with our life. You see, like it's like, I would say, it's virtual without being completely imaginary. It's something that could transform you because of the ideas that you have or because what you do and everything. You could have really a kind of transcendence from the body, let's say. And of course, the idea that he is thinking of here, it is the idea I was describing before, and the importance of these pioneers, that they have created the land, and by the attachment to the land also represent the values that, for instance, Chanoine Gru or others were defending. They are the rural people, they are the ones who have the right traditions, they have the right balance with God and the land and their nation, and they are creating a new race of people. That's why they are called les pères, aussi, because they are the fathers of the nation, in a way. And so all this for him, this is the soul, if you want. This is the soul of the old man that is expressed through this body who become more and more like a thing. It's Plato who says that the soul has something to do with ideas, that if there is a comparison, you could do what is closer to the soul is ideas. But then the idea, of course, are not the idea of Plato, but the idea of Chanoine Gru, which is not exactly the same level. And but you understand this type of kind of balance between the two aspects. Huh? Suzor was also had an activity as a sculptor, as you may know. And he did a sculptural version of his old pioneer. He called him there just the old Canadian pioneer, and it's done in 1912, so just after the drawings that I was showing you just before. And it is against Le Père C. You could recognize him, it's him, who seems to be musing about his past and all that. He smoked his pipe, and on the basis of the sculpture here, you see some of the instruments that he have used, like a saw, like an axe, and things of that nature, because after all, he was a pioneer. He was the one who made the forest go away to create the new land. We have some reaction to this sculpture by journalists of the time, and a guy who's not very important, but let's see, he's called Monsieur Lavergne. And he wrote about this, and he says, I was at the exhibition, it was presented, I think, at the Art Association of Montreal. So here, well, not here at the time, not in this part, we were on the Phillips Square at the time, in 1913, and he heard some comments from the public, you see, in front of this sculpture. And one guy used to look at this and he said, "Si-tu bien ça?" That's really it, you know. That's it. The guy got it. You see, this is really what a type of people I want to identify with. And the journalists had "C'est là de l'excellent nationalisme." This I found interesting because right away he found in this, that's it, you see, this is the real type of the old pioneer, the old Canadian pioneer, a reason to speak of nationalism and to say that there's a big competition with other artists and all that, and Suzor-Coté is good to be on the front line and to have created this type. Few years after, in 1918, Suzor created, I would say, a kind of feminine pendant to the old pioneer. It's called La Compagne du Vieux Pionnier, so the wife of the old pioneer, if you want. 1918. Both sculpture, by the way, are at the Museum of Quebec. And there, again, he gives you an idea of the world in which each one lived. If you look at the basis here, you will see that it's treated like a floor. So meaning that let's say, the universe of the woman is domestic. It's inside the house. And him with his saw and his axes and all that, he's outside the house. But now, of course, at this age, they go back together. It's not for nothing that they turn their back one to the other. There's a kind of alienation in this old couple, and for the old man also, that was going back in this domestic environment where he knows nothing, where he's completely dependent, and probably where he was not completely happy. But that was it. He was turning a thing, and he could not be moved anymore. And so you see there's something pathetic about her, that knitting endlessly like this, and concentrating even as a very old woman, you see, still in these tasks, and again, also representing, like many journalists of the time speak always of the French-Canadian soul, to always this kind of transcendent element that is also stressed in the commentary of this thing. The whole woman, we don't know exactly what is the model there, but Suzor did many charcoal drawing like this one of old lady of the Athabasca region also, who could have been, of course, one of the models that he used for the sculpture. This one is called Madame Gauthier. This is interesting also. You will see he gave always a specific name to these people. They are not just a type. They are individual. And this is interesting because, like I tell you, the idea of making a portrait of a peasant will not have crossed the mind of Plamondon. Plamondon could make the portrait de Madame Pelletier or things like that, which is grande bourgeoise, but not of Madame Gautier. So this, it's like if he was extending, like Suzor was extending this privilege of the portrait, you see, to people who normally would not have asked him for this, who will have lived without being portrayed, or maybe after a while they will have photographs or things like that, but that's it. So this is certainly one aspect of this. I show you other example, like for instance, this one, Le Père Cholette, Jean-Baptiste Cholette, and well, he lived in Ontario, but close to one of the brothers of Suzor-Coté. So that's why the pretext of going to him, and he's certainly a French-Canadian man also. Another of these old pioneer, with fantastic whiskers. I wish I could have this, but he's certainly the only one. And you notice where he is also. Even if the background is not very precise, it is certainly an interior background. And he looks lost there. He looks a little bit not sure of himself. And it's, to me, it's so striking that when he made a profile view of the old man, of the same guy, of Père Cholette again, he looks very different. He looks even younger. Mind you, it was done a little bit before, but nevertheless, let's say at this age, habitually, we don't change so much. We don't have so much difference. If you are 80 and if you are 75, only my wife knows the difference, but I cannot do that. And but the fact that he's represented in profile with a straight back and all this, then you understand that this guy was a pioneer, was in his own world, like acting, let's say, like taking charge of everything. But now that he's in this new environment, he's worried also because they are, not only because of the domestic context, let's say, but also they are conscious of what's happening with time. The agriculture is no more a family affair. Right? It become much and more industrialized. And they know that they will be, their race, if you want, in brackets, will disappear. And so you have certainly something of that in the mood that Suzor tried to express, especially in the left side picture there. He did the same with another old man. Whoops, où est-il? Le voilà. That you see or facing us, or a kind of three-quarter view, is the same man who is called Jean-Baptiste Taillon this time, around 1920. Always pastel. All of them are, or charcoal with the old lady, but all of them are pastels. Mind you, he did also an oil painting from that, from these two pastels. And again, I think even the fact that the personage seems to enter in a kind of darker zone. If you look at his face, the background seems more brilliant than the face itself. Also could be symbolized this kind of aging, and also the anxiety, let's say, of aging. What will happen to us? And all these old men who were tough and we were very strong turn a little bit almost feminine, I would say, with time. They look more fragile and they look more unsure of themselves with time. The problem then I asked myself is, okay, how to characterize a series of portraits, let's say, in terms of art history, and could we have, let's say, somebody before who had tried the same idea? And I thought of Krieghoff. Because Krieghoff indeed will do a series of Habitant also, but in a very different style, of course, because Krieghoff is much before Suzor-Coté. And then it could not be with the same intention. All the context that I describe of the agriculturalism and the nationalism and the racism could not apply to Krieghoff. After all, these portraits of Habitant that he did were almost very commercially intended, most of them. It was easy to sell, there were small paintings, and his clients were the very often officers, English officers that were just passing in Canada, and they wanted to bring back some example, let's say, of the local people like this. And so Krieghoff felt the commercial aspect of this and made tons of them. Habitually, in the exhibition of Krieghoff, we don't show them too much because they look all alike in a way. I remember when you had the Krieghoff show at the Art Gallery of Ontario, they had maybe 50 of these paintings representing Habitant, almost exactly the same. Like you see here, it's a good example. On one side, it's called French-Canadian Habitant, and the other is called French-Canadian Peddler. But it could be, say, if you don't know, you could use one title for one side or the other. It doesn't change anything. It's exactly the same idea. They are on ice, they are walking. You see the landscape is almost the same. I really checked to be sure that I was not presenting two slides of the same painting. Look at the clouds, they are a little bit different, and that's it. So as if it's really like travail à la chaîne, un peu. So he makes a lot of them and all this. But then, okay, you have two theories about this picture of Krieghoff. The people say, especially French-Canadian scholars, they say Krieghoff mocked at us. It's caricature of what we were. And others say, oh, come on, he's not, he's just a good guy, and after all, his wife was French-Canadian, and he was not so far from us and all that. So there's a kind of hesitation. I think, in fact, another context could be interesting to bring there. Krieghoff was born in Holland, but he had been raised in Germany. And there's one thinker in Germany who was renewing, let's say, the approach after the Aufklärung, after the Enlightenment period, the approach to the problem of nations. And it was Herder. Herder is the philosopher who began this kind of more romantic view of what we call the Wohlgeist, the spirit of the nation. He is the philosopher who says it's not true that nations were created by a kind of social contract, like the people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Kant and all the people of the Enlightenment used to say. A nation is built on a kind of social contract. You have an assembly of adults, let's say, who are together and decide, okay, from now on, we will be La France révolutionnaire. After the revolution, for instance, it was a little bit done like that. Here will be our laws, here will be our values, and we decided rationally. This thinker, Herder, says this is not true. He says you are born in a nation. When you are born, you receive already a language, you receive already a series of usages, of belief, even a religion and all that, and this is much bigger than you. It comes from much before you, and each nation has, like this, is I would say, speciality and its nature. And he says there's no nation who should not be protected. It is the time when we begin to be interested, for instance, in folklore, to try to save the songs of this region and that region, and the costume and the way. And all this was, of course, stressed by the Romantic. And I would say this is more probably the context in which Krieghoff tried to work. What he wanted to do is to create a type. If you want, to express the Wohlgeist of French Canada as he could see it. So he did these things, or even, maybe more characteristic, these heads of peasant, of habitant, like they call them, they are very much alike. So imagine 50 like this, it would be terrible. The only variation, sometimes the color of the tuque is different, and here the pipe is not, one is turned toward up, the other toward down. Really, it's a very, very small variation from one picture to the other. It doesn't seem to be a portrait of a specific man. It seems to be really a kind of very general view of, And this, in contrast with Suzor-Coté, it's interesting. Suzor-Coté was trying to find a symbol of the ideas that he have in one specific personage, somebody that he could speak with and he could exchange with. Krieghoff is creating a stereotype, in fact. So he doesn't need to be too close to it. He needs to correspond more to the expectation of his public, of the people who will buy this thing. They will come back with this. I have a real portrait of a French-Canadian habitant. You will see how they look. This is so typical. And so when he got the idea, you could find variation endlessly on this theme. You have this one. Was a little bit different because he seems less sure of himself, and he looks like above like this. And I remember there was a charcoal by Suzor-Coté who had a little bit the same type of look, but again, it was very, very different because the charcoal of Suzor-Coté is called Monsieur Paradis. So we have Balthazar Paradis. The guy's called Balthazar. Plus, c'est formidable. Alors, he gave him a name, and also I would say he transformed him almost as in a religious figure. He looks like a prophet of the Old Testament, or maybe an apostle or something. It will be very difficult to apply that to Krieghoff. He looks rather like a whole drunk. And but it gave an idea again. The contrast between the two, I think, is that one is looking for a stereotype that could be used in any direction, in a way, or positively if you think that this is cite bien ça, he got it, or if you are negative, you say, okay, these are drunks or so. But you can go from one extreme to the other, precisely because it's so general, it's so unindividual. A portrait that you could project in it any content than you want, in a way. I finished my presentation of Krieghoff with these two pictures who represent, of course, the old pioneer as Krieghoff saw them. Now they are going out with their axe and with their saw, and they are a little bit dangerous, a little bit. They are very forceful type of people coming like this with their arms, I would say, against the forest. But again, it seems that he has settled with two types, basically. The whole guy like this, and the younger one that you saw with the toque just before. By the way, this toque that you see here will have two importance in French Canada. In 1837, during the rebellion, you could recognize the revolt by the toque, of course red at the time. And the other importance, the other mention of the toque, it is in the famous Manifesto of Bordeaux of 1948, when he say, "Au diable le goupillon et la tuque," the hell with the holy water sprinkler and the talk. What he meant, of course, in 1948, it has the hell with the religion was symbolized by this kind of instrument. I call it phallic, but I should not do that. This instrument that were used at the high mass to recall baptism, as some Catholic here could remember. And the la tuque, of course, is the symbol of these French-Canadian nationalists of the old days. So, au diable goupillon la tuque in 1948, this is exactly, let's say, a kind of reproduction of it. So, to conclude this first confrontation, let's say, between Krieghoff and Suzor-Coté about this theme of the Habitant, you could say, well, in Suzor you have individual, here you have type or even stereotype, and they come from two different ideological backgrounds. Herder for Krieghoff, and more close to us, thinker like l'Abbé Groux or Le Chanoine Groux for, let's see. By the way, I don't know if you know what a chanoine is. I was asked that recently by some English friend, and I said, well, it's a little bit above a priest and a little bit below a bishop. It's something in between. It's more honorific type of title, but it's something to do with clerics in the Catholic Church. Okay. The other The other confrontation that we could do, and which is interesting also, it is with people who have more or less emulate Suzor-Coté, who try to do a little bit the same. And here I will show you works by a sculptor that at first sight you could say, well, what he's doing here, he should not, we should not deal with him, but you will see that it's very, very close to what Suzor was doing, and especially that Suzor was doing also sculpture. It is sculpture by Alfred Laliberté. La Liberté have made probably a dozen of these busts like this. I will show you 3 of them. This is the first one, who have been cast in bronze. They're about life size, if you want. During, it's not precisely dated, but let's say 1928, 1932. And all the collection is at the Museum of Quebec. So he have, and when you look on the base of the sculpture, he gives there a title, and here it says Le Cultivateur, the farmer, if you want, the peasant. Okay, but if you look at it, he looks really like an individual. He doesn't look like a type like in Krieghoff's picture. He looks exactly like what Suzor-Coté would have done with a subject like that. But he maintained a certain general idea, but not giving us a name, but just a function. Let's say this is le cultivateur, this is the farmer. The same could be said of 2 other in the same series. You see, for instance, on the left you have the blacksmith, and then, on the right, le forgeron. Well, on the right is the blacksmith, and here he call him, on the left, l'homme de chantier. These are the lumberjacks that go in the forest and all that. And again, they are so typified, and so individualized, that it will be hard to think that he didn't have a precise model in front of him. So La Liberté did that, which is very close to Suzor-Coté in a way. The 2 were already knew each other very well. I don't know if they were quite close friends, because La Liberté was not friends with many people, with anybody. He wrote a terrible text. It's called Les Artistes de mon temps, Artists of My Days. And he succeeded to say something bad to everyone, about everyone. He always have a little remarks. This one sell n'importe quoi. He's terrible. He's like a whole grouch. And anyway, he had then another idea, okay, to make type like this. And then he got enthralled in what he called les légendes, métiers et coutumes d'autrefois series. Okay, I translate, let's say, the legend or the folklore of the past, the craftsmanship of all the craft that was known also, and the usage, let's say, the coutume, the customs that we had in the old days. This was a series of 214 bronze that he did like this on many years, and then he wanted to sell that as a collection. It was a long process, but finally the Museum of Quebec bought all of them with the money of the government, so that means with our tax money. Bon. And these 214 little statues are in bronze and are depicting, I would say, one after the other, the different craft or different attitude, of course, of the people of the country, of the countryside. La Liberté says, I was born in the country and I worked like a farmer in my youth, so I know, I would say, from the inside all this, and this one I want to left to the society, let's say, a kind of memorial of all these usage. So this photo was taken in the studio of La Liberté. La Liberté bought on Sainte-Famille Street a big house, and he used a story for himself where he had his studio of sculpture, and above he rented studios to other artists. So among them there was Suzor-Coté, another was Holgate, another was Pilot, And so these people were living with La Liberté, more or less. Each one have his own. And I guess for La Liberté, it was a way also to make some money that could cover the expenses of his own atelier. So the photo is taken there, and the statuette I'm talking about, you have few examples here, but I will show you a close-up of some of them. So each time, he will concentrate on a tool, let's say like here, a scythe, and also on gesture, that will be specific, for instance, how to really make it sharpen, to sharpen it, and costume, also attitude of the people, and as if he will analyze like this in 214 statuettes of that kind. They are about big like this, they are not very, very big, all the métier, all the craft he could remember of his youth. So I will not show you 214 because I will empty the place here. But just to give you a few examples of them, here it's a woodcutter, of course, with an old saw. No? And you have the hay binder. So it's really sometimes, it's not really a craft by itself. It's more a gesture. It's more something that you have to know how to do it properly, let's say. And so you make, they are not very aesthetically successful, at least to my eyes. They are a little bit soft. You feel that they were done first in clay, and then transposed in plaster and finally in bronze, like they used to do at the time. So, but you still feel a little bit of this kind of softness of the clay, and sometimes they look a little bit sloppy like this. So aesthetically, but I think in a way, this was not the main intention of La Liberté. La Liberté was obsessed by the fact that these métiers are disappearing, and that him who is old and who remembered them should create a little vignette like this that will be able to recall. Another example, the rake. So with a lady, with this type of tool. Here is the sickle, of course. You see it with her gesture here. And she's cutting some wheat that she holds. And let's see. Sometimes you have a little group, like this one. Comment est-ce que je traduirais ça? Ça s'appelle la corvée du couvre-pied. Le couvre-pied, c'est le quilt. So I would say something like maybe the quilt duty or something. So as if the women are together and they are sewing this quilt. And so sometimes you have group like this, but most of the time it's one gesture and one thing. So there is indeed, I says, okay, if aesthetically they are not completely satisfying, there is indeed one aspect which is very strong there. I would call it the ethnographic aspect of this. As if you want to be an historian of the old manners of the past, and you want to save them to the future generation. And indeed, when you think of it, what I was mentioning before about the change in terms of the Enlightenment, let's say, where you define humanity by, let's say, a certain nature and certain values like this, and have been pushed out by this more Volgaite attitude in which, okay, all the things come from your past, that there's a lot of unconscious in what we get from the history before us. You could say that this ethnographic aspect is born also from this idea. Let's say the modern human science come none so much from the Enlightenment, but come more from these traditionalist thinkers that were putting more importance on folklore, on defining this specific culture different from one the other. And so then suddenly you have anthropology, ethnology, you have these new science that appear that says basically that the Enlightenment was blind, because they were imagining that you could create society just by, like Rousseau, a contrat social, say, by a social contract. They were blind, and we are the real scientific. Now we know how the things happen. There is so much unconscious in this creation of this nation that we have to recognize. Language is not created from like this. Usage, religion, belief, and everything. And so you understand that even this ethnographic attitude, which seems more scientific in a way, is also something to do with the tradition. Okay, I have not completely finished with Suzor-Coté. And you will see, it's like I kept that up to the end to keep you here, because it's a fantastic story to finish with. There is two drawings, let's say, of Suzor-Coté that I want to show you because they were, let's say, linked to another work, much more modern in character, that I want to show you after. Oh, this one is called le cheminot. That means the wanderer, let's say the man, the vagabond, if you want. And it's 1926, and it's a charcoal, and you see, he looks like he's maybe a little bit younger than the old man that we saw already. But Suzor did one portrait of him, and then he decided to make another portrait of the same guy, but with a different stand of the head, and he called it the Canadian peasant, the French Canadian peasant. So the vagabond now turns as to be one of the whole guys, but he doesn't give his name. And to my surprise, you see the same guy suddenly transformed in a bishop by also Suzor-Coté, and this belongs to the collection of this museum, so maybe you could see it. And where more or less it's not a bishop of anything, it's his peasant that suddenly take this look. That's interesting in a way because that means it's classical, so in art history, that you have the same form with meaning, with different meaning. You could have a situation like that you use the same form and you twist it a little bit in one direction or the other, you give them other meanings. Okay, that will be a kind of conclusion to my Suzor-Coté show, but it's not finished because there was a new connection suddenly with a painting. The same model appears here in a Louis Moulstock painting. Yeah? How do we know that? It is, okay, it's called Joe Lavallée with a Bowl of Soup. And Moulstock tells the story this way. He says, I met on the street, like he used to do. I don't know if some of you have known Louis Moulstock. He was a wonderful, very delightful fellow. He died recently, very, very old age. And he says, I was on the street and suddenly I see a beggar, somebody who was without work. And I asked him to pose for me, to be a model. And he accepted. And during the pause, he says, you know, it's not the first time I do that. He says, with whom do you do it? He says, with a painter of Arthabasca region where I come from. And this, of course, happened in Montreal. And a man called Suzor-Coté. And so Moulstock is all excited. He knew what Suzor-Coté was. And he told after that when he came to the museum here, he saw suddenly my Joe Lavallée, he says, transformed in a bishop. He said, I couldn't believe my eyes. But what happened was, in fact, a little bit tragic because Joe Lavallée now was in a refuge of unemployed people. It's during the crisis, during the Depression. Let's see, the Louis Lavallée with a Bowl of Soup in 1931, 1932. It's just after the crash, and it's a very, very difficult year. So probably the fate of this poor man was that he left the country where he lost his job and thought to find something in Montreal, but then he was too old probably, and he ended up in one of these refuge. It was well organized. The Jews are their own, the Protestants are their own, and the Catholics have two. Well, la Société Saint-Jean-Baptiste et les Sœurs de la Providence. L'œuvre de la soupe. This was the salvation of everybody. You could have a soup. And so that's exactly what's happening to him. He's in one of these refuge, and then without too much meaning to his life, all the dream that we have before is like going away. And Moulstock did this painting of him, and he did also a drawing in which you see him again. He's here. He called it the Last Supper, but it's a kind of in joke, if you want, the Last Supper, not of Christ and the apostle, but in one of these refuges. And so you see all these old people without jobs, completely isolated, each one in his little corner. And our Joe Lavallée is here with his bowl of soup, like the others. He did also, because Mulstock is always compassionate, he created a lino gravure. It's gone with lino, where he gave him a female companion. Probably that was impossible because the nuns will not have permitted that. You had in the refuge, you have a refuge for les hommes, and you have a refugette for les femmes. This does not go together. And so this is certainly completely imaginary from Woodstock. And okay, but then the problem I had, I says, okay, well, what is the signification of that in Woodstock work? I will show you a few other things, and you will see there's a kind of recurrent theme that I think is quite profound and interesting, even in comparison to what we have said up to now. This is a drawing, let's say a charcoal with sepia and with some white chalk of who Mulstock have entitled Unemployed Lying. Unemployed sleeping, if you want. There are people, there are like many studies of few peoples that he saw, and it's again 1932, 1933, so it's always the same period. He went what was called at the time, and still, the Fletcher's Field. You know where this is? It's near the mountain. I'd say, like if you take Park and you have these big monuments, in front is the Fletcher Fields. And it was a kind of open, rather unkept park where the most ragged and depressed people used to go, and especially at the time when there was no employment. So they went there to sleep during all summer and things like that. And Mulstock says at the time he was very poor. He come from a family, I think his father was a kind of fruit merchant. And he was going with a cart like this in the street and selling fruits to little shops around. They were living on Saint-Dominique Street, but near Sainte Catherine. So really, it doesn't exist anymore, these places. They're all being transformed. But so he came from a poor family. He says, I didn't have much money to buy fancy paper and things, and I used craft paper, which was the paper that his father used to pack, let's say, the fruits that he was selling. So that's why some of them are in quite fragile condition. Look, another one was called, which rather touching, I would say, Portrait of William O'Brien, Unemployed, of 1939. And again, charcoal and chalk on so as if Mulstock was attracted by these people who lost the meaning that they had before in their life, and they are waiting for this work that will give them some meaning, but for the moment, there's nothing of that. And the most, so you have all these series of drawings on the theme of the unemployed, let's say, and you have also a series he did in hospitals. But, okay, then again, it was a little bit the same type of situation where people were sick and could not do much, were just living there. But he went to really extreme cases, like this poor woman who's called Paranka. That's the only thing that he knew about her was, we don't know if it's first or second name, he called her Paranka. And it's a drawing of 1932. He tells the story of his encounter with Paranka. I will read it to you in his words. He says, she was brought to my attention at the time by a friend of ours who was a doctor. It was in the Montreal General Hospital. She was a patient who had been there for 14 years in a crib. It was a pituitary disease that reduced her to a skeleton. Paranka had no vision at all. Her eyes were wide open, and the nurse asked her to sit up. She was going to have her picture taken. And so she sat for 5 to 10 minutes and then took the sheet and just covered her head completely and curled up like a little animal. Sheltered, that was the end of it. I could not draw anymore. And I came back the next day and I tiptoed in quietly, and when I began to draw, she heard the sound of the charcoal on the paper. when you use charcoal. And so she recognized the sound, and she did the same thing again, just covered herself, and that was no more. I went back, I sat patiently again, moved further back from the cot where she was, and I drew. And so for 5 or 6 sessions, I was able to come back and observe her and got to know her face. What is extraordinary in this case, it is this gesture of covering her face. You could say that she was at the limit of humanity in a way, like not being able to see anything, being reduced to, I don't remember, I think she weighed something like 50 pounds or something, very, almost a living skeleton. And to be enough self-conscious, to have this gesture, you see, if he makes my portrait, I don't like myself to be seen like this, and I want to cover myself. This is extraordinary. You could put that in a more general context by reflecting about what happened in the concentration camps, where some inmate become so discouraged and so out of any control of their situation, well, because of hunger and because of all the suffering they were become suddenly very fatalist and could just go to the German and get killed by them, for instance. In the camp, they used to call them der Musulman. Why? Because maybe there's a kind of spontaneously you associate Muslim with fatalism, let's say. Maybe that was behind, whatever the reason with it. But this, you could say, they were crossing the limit of humanity. They still have the human shape, but they were no more human in a way because they didn't have this reflex that Paranka have, you see, to cover her face or to have a certain subjective dignity. And when you reflect to this context, you could say that we are now, with the drawings of Mulstock, in a situation where there's a big opposition between life as a form of life and life, I would say, naked life. Life as a form of life, this was what the Chanoine Gru was trying to define. Let's say you will have some tradition, we will live in the land, and we will have this and that and that. When you define a form of life, especially in nationalist term and in racial term and in religious one and all that, you immediately also exclude some people. You could say you create the state of exception to that rule. You define your society and all this. This is very good for the people who are in. But the others who are not of your nation, who are not of you, who doesn't speak your language or doesn't share your religion, are excluded. And then what happened to them suddenly, if this society is very well structured and very powerful, suddenly you have these people who are excluded and in a way are disposable. This is exactly what was happening to these guys. They were all defined by the Abbé Gru definition, and suddenly the economic crash come and wiped out all these ideas and reduced these people to the life, to the naked life. The only thing that counts, that's why you have this kind of wary look in these unemployed, because they're in front of nothing. They are left with life. And the paradox it is, okay, we, for instance, Foucault have examined that very well. He says that our society have created places of exception like that, where we push people and we reduce them to pure life. He says, for instance, prison are like that. When you are in a prison, that any experience of being in a prison, they will tell you that it is the feeling that you lose all form of life. You are just somebody who lived there and could be manipulated and could be mistreated and all that, and you don't have too much recourse. You are just one inmate, you are a number. You lose this kind of protection, let's say, that a certain culture or a certain definition of culture will create. Hospital could be like that too. Like the Paranka is a good example. She's prolongated like this for 14 years in a kind of completely secluded area without any contact whatsoever with the world. And she's pure again, an example of naked life. Foucault have examined that in the hospital and in the prison, but also, of course, the concentration camps were a perfect example of that, in which people were reduced to naked life. Mulstock came soon enough not to know that. As a Jew, he could have been, if he was in Europe at the time, he would have probably ended up in one of these camps. But he came in 1911 in Canada with his family, so they were safe from that. But I would say he never treated directly subject linked to the Holocaust. But the feeling he had of that even in democracy, you could have zone of exception like that, where people are excluded and are reduced to pure life or just to live, just to be just living being. I think he had the feeling of what it was. It's Hannah Arendt who says that in the concentration camps, what you learn is that everything is possible. There's no law, there's no values to stop anyone to make anything. And recently we have an example of that, of course, with the American soldier, with the Iraqi. We have a little inkling of what it can happen in this context, where you degrade the other and you reduce it to just to be excluded, to be just naked life, and eventually disposable. That you are no more an entity, you are no more the dignity of a person. So it's very extraordinary to my mind that this Joe Lavallée could be the model of two excellent painters, and have served to two different purposes like that. And Mulstock certainly have the one who have see more profoundly what it's all about. Okay, thank you.